Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agri. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. In this episode, we are at Groundswell 2022, and I'm talking to farmers George Fraser, David White and Peter Cartwright, as well as Andrew Richards, Senior Agronomist at Agri. In this podcast, we're going to be looking at the transition to regenerative agriculture. You know, what are the learns and what are those experiences that can be shared with others in the farming community? What is the net gain for the farm and the farm business? So let's ask you, George, first. Let's find out whereabouts you farm. Where do you farm?
So we're down in Dorset on the Wiltshire border. We've got many soil types, ranging from clays, sands, and with varying degrees of flint.
Yeah. And what do you actually farm there?
So we are arable farmers. We do also have a herd of cattle and a contracting business as well.
Oh, so you're busy down there on that farm down there. And if I can come to you, Peter, whereabouts do you farm?
Okay, so we're in Lincolnshire, just on the edge of the wold, so the foot wold, where the flat meets the hills, if you like. On there, predominantly very mix of soil types. So we've got some fairly heavy, low, slow draining clays. We're at just below sea level on some of it, and then we'll move up onto the edge of the wolds where we've got some nice medium, chalky types of soils up there.
So you two as growers, representing growers across the UK, you're actually covering a lot of different soil types, aren't you? From those lighter lands, those flints, across to that heavy marl, if you like, and that clay as well. So that's going to be really interesting, listening to your experiences. And Andrew Richards, as an agronomist, just remind us of the geographical area that you cover.
I'm based up in North Oxfordshire and cover from brash through to sort of a lot of heavy clay down through the Vale of Aylesbury, and also get on to some of the sort of chalkier soil just around sort of Newbury area.
Yeah, and we're here at Groundswell 2022. So, guys, how would you describe the soil here that we're kicking around under our feet? How would you describe that?
I'd say, without having looked too in depth, but there's obviously some clay content there, reasonably loamy.
Yeah.
We definitely typical of some of the soils we have back at home.
In fact, when you walked up here, you've already made your mark. This is what farmers do, isn't it? You kick the dirt and, what's the land like? What's the land like? So let's start us off, because we want to learn from your experiences as farmers and growers in terms of this transitioning experience. So in summary, to begin with, what have you learned? What's been your big takeaway, George, as you stand here today?
I think really take home for me is trying to build resilience in our soils with the wet weather patterns we're seeing as well. So, and we have seen that, we've managed to achieve that. With the sands particularly, we're seeing better water holding capacity and more resilient to drought. Also on the clays, we're improving trafficability and infiltration rates. So yeah, we're just trying to improve the workability of our soil really.
And when we talk about resilience, it's very easy to make that glib statement, I want to improve resilience, but what has that actually meant for you on farm?
I think it's just trying to eliminate the peaks and troughs. Trying to sort of level out the anomalies in our crops with the weather pattern.
And in terms of resilience, Peter, does that mean the same thing for you on your farm?
Yeah, it certainly does. Like I say, it's evening it out. The weather throws such bizarre patterns at us nowadays. It's really trying to be able to sustainably farm no matter what the weather's putting at us. I mean, we're finding on our heavy clay soils, I never thought we'd be able to farm in those in sort of end of October into November. I was actually told you've got to be off them lands by the middle of October, which you'll never get in on them again. We're now finding them soils are actually the soils we can go at when we get wet. They're my go-to soils, which is absolutely bizarre for when we've got medium sort of into sands. It's the heavy clays which we are now being able to travel on when it's wet. But that is the resilience we're getting into these soils now. It's enabling us to, whatever weather patterns, whatever waters we get at us, the resilience is there in the soil to take our machinery, what we've got.
Yeah, and that trafficability, which you mentioned a bit earlier on, I mean, that's an enormous step change in terms of your ability to work the land, isn't it? But I mean, are you able to qualify? What does that mean as a business, a farming business? What does that mean?
Quite, was it 2 years ago we had that horrendous wet autumn. We was able to get out of our sort of 450 hectares, 300 hectares of wheat actually in the ground, which went on to produce a crop I know a lot of people in the similar area got no winter wheating at all. They were all on spring wheat. So as a business, it meant my rotation was able to stay exactly as it was. Even in one of the most dire autumns we'd had, we still got 300 hectares of winter wheat in the ground. The rest was made up with spring barley, but there's a point when you just can't do no more. But it meant, because of the resilience, I didn't have to really alter my rotation at all. We was able to carry on, but we'd got the winter wheat in. We actually got our harvest then completed in a timely fashion. Meant we could actually go contracting harvesting with our combine, because everybody else was getting stuck into spring wheat. We were finished, so off we went to actually do some contracting.
Well, fantastic. So you were able to get more business work done, weren't you? I mean, off to do contracting, getting 300 hectares of crop in the ground. I mean, Andrew, that's a really significant improvement in farming performance, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I was probably at the centre, unfortunately, of both the autumn 19 and 20 in our area that overlapped in that wet, with many farmers not drilling any crops at all in the autumn in both those years. So those farms where their soil was in that condition, where we built stronger resilience from less cultivation, where they had got the drainage and invested in the drainage and ditching in the previous years, really did start to count.
Yeah. So let's walk down and kick the soil around a bit. So as we walk down, George, I'm really interested just to hear, in terms of this improving resilience, and we're walking past a huge piece of kit right now, what have you actually done that's different? What have you done that's, in terms of operations, that's different on farm?
Yeah, I think with resilience, obviously there's a financial implication with that as well. And so organic matter has really always played a part in what we do, but now there's definitely a bigger focus on that. By improving our organic matters, we've definitely improved water holding capacity, infiltration rates, nitrogen use efficiency, and actually better nutrient cycling as well. So we're managing to reduce our synthetic inputs, and reduce our costs on those.
So how have you done that? What have you done?
Cover crops are integral.
What cover crops?
So it's targeted approach really, but a good example of our cover crops are maybe phacelia, buckwheat, sunflowers, buckwheat. So we're just trying to incorporate as many plant species as we can.
Right. Are you doing the same, Peter?
Yeah, on a similar type of level. I mean, we've gone from a heavy plough-based system to now 92% direct drill. So yeah, we've had a big shift in our whole approach, but that hasn't been done overnight. We've done that over sort of the last 8 to 10 years, mainly the last 8 years. Had a vision in mind sort of 8 years ago, knew we wanted to go down the direct drill route, but it's took us till now to get there. And in that time, we've gone from having 5 hectares of cover crops on the land to now having 450 hectares of cover crops, and some catch crops in there as well. And a bit like George says there, yeah, bringing species in. We used to keep it simple, just one species, spring oat in front of a bean, for example. That was my cover crop. But as we've learnt more, we've started introducing more and more into it. In front of a spring bean, we are still just a spring oat, because it does exactly what I need for that crop. Don't need anything else. But in front of a spring oat, for example, that's when we're bringing the diversity in there. We're grazing them crops off, so it's allowing me to bring stuff in just to give the sheep something to graze on, but then I'm also looking at what I want to happen to the soil, so it allows us to open the whole variety up. So we've got phacelia, vetches, rye, linseed and some oil radishes in there, and we will keep looking to see what we need. But we don't just put a cover in because it's trendy to put a crop in there. I need to know what it's bringing to me in the rooting zones, and what its nitrogen breakdown ratio is. We look at everything. We've got a lot of trials on farm. We go across into France to have a look what's happening there. So we put a lot of detail into the actual cover crops we're growing as well, rather than just picking off a list and going, oh, we'll have that.
And both of you strike me as being incredibly focused when it comes to this transition. You know, quite serious, but really knowledgeable about what you're doing on that farm. Have I got that right?
I'd say so, yeah. I think knowing each field individually on your farm is crucial, and having an understanding of what's going on in the soil and the plants you're growing. Yeah, I'd say. Yeah. It definitely focuses the mind in a no-till system.
And Peter, have you been more focused? I see that you've got a big smile on your face. Is that a fair reflection?
Yeah, you're focused on it, but every year it throws up new surprises. Yeah. I wouldn't say I necessarily know what I'm doing every time.
Okay, so go on then, share. What have, from both of you actually, what have been the surprises? It doesn't always go well, does it?
The problem is we're not in control of the weather. If we could control the weather, we could grow the perfect cover crop to do exactly what it says on the tin every time. but for example 2 years ago, such a dry August, you put your cover crop in and it does not do what it says it should do on the tin. So then you're thinking, well, I wasted all my money on that. And you couldn't graze it with the sheep, so everything you'd set to do, you couldn't actually do. So you had to adopt your approach and going forward on it. So it's always full of surprises, but the one thing what you learn from it is, even though it's not put the top matter on, it does put the roots down, and that's what actually matters for you. You couldn't graze the sheep on it, not a problem. It's put the root mass into there, and I think that's what we're learning from it, is it's what's happening under the soil, not necessarily what's just happening on the top.
So that's a really interesting reflection. So that's also, it doesn't matter what the farmer next door is saying when he looks over the fence, is it? Because actually what's happening beneath the soil. So George, for you, has it been okay when it hasn't always gone well?
Yeah, I'd say so. We haven't run into too many difficulties. Most of the difficulties you do have, you'd get in any system of farming anyway. So if we're suffering with weather pressure, someone in a no-till or plough-based system would be experiencing that too, I'd say.
And Andrew, do you think that farmers are being brave in trying out some of these new techniques?
Yeah, a lot are, and a lot are looking to this process. I mean, I think the one thing I'd really sort of put up is really what Peter's done, is that too many people start off by thinking about the drill rather than getting the soil into condition. And yesterday, again, I was talking to another farmer, and it's really 6 or 7 years into the process that he's actually gone out and bought his Horsch Avatar drill. He's been gradually reducing that soil's dependence on cultivation. Gradually, as Peter was saying, you've got to wean those soils off cultivation. The worst thing you can go and do is buy a direct drill and try it on land that hasn't had any preparation. Get the drainage right, get the organic matter right, and start to sort of get that strength back into the soil, which comes from doing less cultivations.
So just looking here, this is part of the demonstration plots here at Groundswell 2022. They're demonstrating a lot of kit on this. So George, from your perspective, what are we looking at?
Just a quick glimpse into here. We're seeing some rye, there's some legume there, some clover. There is some other things there like wheat, there is some brome, some thistle.
So black grass.
Yeah, quite a lot of black
Lots
grass.
of black grass. So, you know, one could argue to say, well, it's a bit of a mess. Andrew, is this a mess? Is this something we should be worried about? You know, weeds, burdens building, or is actually this part of the game?
Well, I think it's a sort of a learning part of what works for you. Now, yesterday we were looking at a lot of where we've been doing these AB15 mixtures in environment stewardship, where you're leaving for a couple of years. And the species that you have in there makes such a difference. Some of the plots have absolutely no black grass or brome in, and some are having 200 or 300 plants even in year 2 per square, you know, in those plots. And that difference between creating that sort of right cover can snuffle out the weeds or allow them to take over. And obviously here, sadly, the black grass is rather taken over. And if you're looking at it as a break to improve your position with black grass, it's not going to be much of a benefit.
So we've still got to have that attention to detail, and as you were saying, Peter, is really understand what is the impact of those actions you're taking on farm. Otherwise, that weed burden, as an example here, could start to increase, couldn't it? And from the point of view, you know, you've talked about resilience. 1 second here. Hello. Are you joining us? So luckily, we've just been joined by David White, a farmer who also spoke at the seminar here at Groundswell 2022. So brilliant to see you here, David. So just remind us, whereabouts do you farm?
I farm between Cambridge and Newmarket.
And what sort of soils are you farming there, and the crops?
Yeah, fine sandy loam over chalk, and we have some peat soil as well, so we have quite a variation. And I demonstrated that in one of the slides, that presentation earlier. And combinable crops only. I used to be a sugar beet grower, but I've given that up to preserve my soil health and structure. And so a diverse rotation, but it all has to go through the combine.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really brings in the full variety of soils we could see in the UK, because you're adding in the peats as well, which both Peter and George don't farm on. We've just been talking about soil resilience, particularly with regards to water retention and water management, and we've also been talking about, you know, the impact that if we don't get things right, some of the weed burdens, for example here, as we can see with blackgrass, can become even more of a problem. From your point of view, if we move on from the area of resilience, what else have you learnt in that transition to regen farming yourself on your farm?
I think firstly, be brave. Don't worry about what other people think. Look at people that have made a success of this, and I've been fortunate enough to be on farm visits here and abroad and we have dinner in the evening, and you'll be on a table with somebody that's been doing this for 20 years, which is quite unusual in the UK, less unusual in France, and the buzz and the confidence that you get talking to somebody that's made it work for 20 years is enormous, and that's what we need, and that's what's great about the Groundswell event, is because we're on a show with lots of positive people who are wanting to make this work, but who also have made this work and got the figures to prove it. And Pete earlier talked about various figures for his farm in the presentation.
Yeah, and I heard you actually had it was a packed arena for you guys. Peter, what are the figures, if you can remember some of them? Can you share? What are they?
It was mainly on the diesel side of it. So sort of 8 years ago, we were burning around 130 litres a hectare of diesel. Now through the whole transition, we are sat at around 70 litres a hectare. Massive impact where we sit with diesel prices at the moment. That's airing on to over £60,000 a year just saving on diesel alone. Yet we haven't had an impact on our yield. Our yield is actually averaging 1 tonne a hectare more on the winter wheat. So the shift changes what we've done. I have to monitor it closely. I am the manager for an estate, and we have to watch costs closely. So I have to go and report whatever I do to the board and maintain the profitability of it.
And George, bring you in here. Is the detail in the finances and the figures as much as it has to be in watching what you're doing with the crop?
Yeah, it certainly does. I guess I come from a slightly different perspective, being a contract farmer and a contractor. Being less experimental is probably where I come from. Obviously, we need to deliver on our customers' objectives from day one. We have to be careful. But as David said, we want to add new things and be experimental where we can.
You were going to comment about diesel as well, David.
Yes, it's really interesting that, Peter mentioned 130 litres a hectare, while Peter's on much heavier land on some of his farm than I am. It's getting involved in Regen Ag that concentrates the mind on inputs and how we use less. And certainly now, I worked it out last year because we're interested in carbon footprint and monitoring things more than we would have done in the past. We're on 38 litres a hectare, stubble to stubble through harvest, and whilst 138 litres a hectare, whilst 138 on light land compared to 130 or what Peter's using now might seem a lot, the harvesting operation is a big part of that, and we can't make combines use less fuel. So we're 138 litres a hectare, and including maintenance jobs around the farm, mowing, hedge cutting and that sort of thing, we're 2 tractor hours per hectare. And I sometimes think, well, actually 2 tractor hours per hectare, what am I spending all that time doing? Because I'm drilling the farm twice and fertilising it and spraying it. What am I? And I think there's a scope to get that down even more. But it's not until you start talking to other people that have done similar things that you can benchmark yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about, having that dinner and talking to other people, and not just in the UK, but in other countries. Andrew, you've been offering a benchmarking service for quite a period of time, haven't you?
We started, really, I suppose, when we started computerising recommendations back in the 1990s. And we've got a number of farms that have been contributing on a yearly basis through that period. And the one thing that really picks out is that there's been a lot less difference in total spend. It's more a question of getting operations at the right time, and where you've got your soil in the right condition, that can really help. And it's those farmers that are always a week late are the ones where the overall performance tends to sort of pull them down.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of this transition, though, something that's on everyone's mind at the moment is inputs. We talked a lot about diesel, we talked about trafficability, getting on the land. So talk us through, what have you learned and what have you managed to gain in terms of the nutrient availability on your land? David, what are your thoughts?
What have I learned? I've learned that for 40 years of my farming career I was applying P and K unnecessarily and lining somebody's pockets, probably because my indices aren't going down now, using catch and cover crops and always having something growing, and we're recycling the nutrition that is in the soil. And you will, anyone that has soil analysed will realise there's a lot of natural nutrition there, enough to keep us going for years. We need to understand how to unlock it, and that's one of the big findings. There's a whole slug of cash I've been spending that I haven't needed to.
Wow, so that's a big step forward, or a big gain rather, isn't it?
Big gain.
In terms financially. And for you, Peter?
Yeah, well, I'd second what David's just said there. We're exactly the same, in fact. So we had all our fields analysed by the zone for their P&K and mag and organic matters as well in 2017. Our P&K results just came back from last harvest, and my actual P's and K's are going up, and that's without us applying base dressings to it. But it's like you say, it's the crops we're using, the oats, what we use as a cover crop, they're actually there because they are good at scavenging P out of the soil. We're on the chalky wolds, which is high in pH. You're up into the 8s. We've got bags of P in that ground, but it's locked up, it's not available. So the idea of using the oats is to get that available into the system for us, and it is certainly working because we are seeing our indices as well holding or building without us actually putting stuff on.
And your comments in terms of reflections on David's comments demonstrate that every farm and every field and every soil type is going to be slightly different, isn't it? George, from your point of view, let's move off P&K. N, nitrogen point of view, very expensive. Have you noticed any gains there, any steps forward on your farm?
Yeah, so I think with nitrogen we're just focused on efficiency really. So using things like inhibitors to reduce leaching and volatilisation. That's enabled us to cut our nitrogen rates generally by 40 kilos a hectare. Also using foliar N, so we're replacing 40 kilos of nitrogen that would have otherwise been applied by liquid fert, and we're using the foliar N.
So for all the listeners, for how long have you been in this transition period? David?
6 years. This is my 6th year into no-till and doing things in a much different way on the farm.
So 6 years. And George?
Yeah, 6 years going into our 7th, yeah.
Are you just copying him?
Yeah.
And Peter?
Yeah, well, we're about 8 years since we started making the subtle changes, but we've done it slowly over time. So we sort of de-risk what we were doing and allow the soil to catch up with us.
And from a UK perspective, Andrew, taking that, great UK sort of spread that Agri has with all of its agronomists, where do you think farmers are in terms of that transition period? How many years in do you think the average is?
Very broad question, that, Tony. I think it's a lot. Unfortunately, it's a smaller percentage than it should be, with a lot of people continuing to do what they've always done, hoping that next year will bring better weather conditions. And too much, unfortunately, land in the UK is also farmed on these short-term rental agreements, which is tending to inhibit people from wanting to start moving to something that could create some sort of transitional, hiccups and not that sort of smoothness. And I think that's why I think George is particularly brave in what he's done and bringing along his customers with him down in Dorset.
Yeah, in the contracting business that you have, so you're contract farming there. So it is quite a different model, isn't it? To I think yours, Peter, you're the manager of the estates, and yours, David. So it's very interesting. You've all got different businesses, haven't you? And yet this transition has yielded real benefits in much the similar way. If we look at diesel, trafficability, etc. George, what are your thoughts on what Andrew just said about your farm business being different and bringing your farming partners, if you like, along with you?
Yeah, I think an important part of that is sort of taking our customers on the journey, if you will. They feel involved, they get quite enthusiastic about the system, and that certainly helps the transition.
So how do you communicate that? How do you talk to them? How do you bring them along on that journey?
Yeah, I think in our area we're quite well known now for the way we farm, and generally our customers who come to us are also that way inclined as well. So generally we start by benchmarking all the ground, so we use Riser to zone our ground and then perform in-depth analysis on each soil type, and then I think having a benchmark, our customers look forward to the next 3 or 4 years where they hope to see an improvement.
Right, and here we are, as you said, we're at Groundswell. It's a terrific event. If you haven't been along to this event, it really is just a hive of exchange of experiences and knowledge, isn't it? It really is. All the seminar tents, as yours. Of course, yours was the busiest, but they are very, very full. David, you talked about that, having that dinner and exchanging ideas. How fundamentally important is that to help us as an industry take the next step forward?
I think it's crucial, actually, because farmers will take notice and believe farmers, because we're not we're not natural salesmen. We haven't got anything to sell other than our experience, and that's something that we're very happy to share. And I've always been so pleased to work in an industry where people are happy to share their costs and information about their business, whereas if we were producing cars or washing machines, of course, we would have kept that really close to our chest. So, the farming community has always been very good at that, and I think that's why we benefit and can do what we do.
Yeah, and Andrew, from your point of view, I know you do lots of talks with farmers and to farmers, so what are your thoughts? How valuable is that exchange of experience?
I think it's absolutely fundamental, which is one of the reasons we, I think, developed that sort of iFarm concept of, rather than just all small replicated plot trials, working with farmers who are interested in particular topics at more of a sort of part field level. And the farmers really much like to go around and visit farms where they are seeing how the farmer's doing, a few warts and all, rather than just seeing some rather glossy plots. And to actually, in those conversations afterwards over a cup of tea or a sandwich or that burger or whatever, that really sort of help, they sort of start to gel those ideas. And and I think that exchange puts agriculture in a very unique position.
Yeah. So let's wander up to the top here and start to make our way back to some refreshments, I would say. But the one question I'm going to ask you to finish this podcast with is, what one top tip have you learnt that you would like to share with other growers? David, can I start with you?
Yes, certainly. I think top tip is be brave, be bold, try things, because unless you've tried it, you don't know whether it will work or not. And if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world, and you can always retreat a step and then take a slightly different path next time.
And what one technical thing have you done different on your farm that's been the biggest win?
Technical thing, have faith and don't disturb soil, because the traditional farmer in us all believes or has believed that you need to disturb soil, and every time I disturb soil I regret it afterwards, and you just got to be brave and nothing more than seed depth.
So what's been the biggest win that you found on farm in your case?
I think profitability really, and reducing our input costs is probably the biggest win.
And what one technical thing have you done that's different on your farm?
I think improving on organic matters has been crucial. One thing I would say is sort of don't run before you can walk, really. It's easy to get overwhelmed with the amount of things that you can do within a no-till system. So I think concentrate on what you're doing and sort of, get each step correct, really.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, George. Peter?
Yeah, and top tip is having an aim in mind. I've always had an aim where I want to get to. How you get there, you're going to have a little bit of flexibility, because what works on my land might not quite work on next door. There might be a little tweaking needing to do it, but as long as you know where you want to get to, then you will get there. You will find the way of getting there.
And Andrew, a slightly different question for you. From your perspective, for the farmer that is either hesitating or is just starting to get into that transition period, what would be your top tip for them?
I think is getting the soil in the right, improve that condition where you can start to do less to it. Getting that sort of that drainage right, and the ditching, I think is got to be the fundamental, and starting to sort of build that. How are you going to build that organic matter? And those two things combined is really what it's about, not which drill or which crop. It's getting that fundamentals of the soil in a condition of greater resilience.
So thank you to all for sharing your valuable experience in the transition period into regenerative agriculture. There are some other great podcasts on regen agriculture and soils here on Tramlines, well worth a listen. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agri.co.uk. See you next time.